But it's great to see a lot of people in New Zealand waking up very early to come and join us this evening, which is wonderful. Oh, good morning, Peter from Dunedin. I think you're probably warmer than what we are here at the moment. We've got a steady stream coming in right now. Amazing. Fantastic. Well, everyone's very prompt tonight and this morning, so thank you very much, and kia ora and welcome to everybody. And thank you for joining us for tonight's EU-UK export update. We're working with the wonderful team at DLA Piper and also New Zealand Trade and Enterprise to bring you tonight's webinar. I'm Sarah Fogarty. I'm the UK Regional Director for KEA, based here in London, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Joining us today are our panel of experts from DLA Piper and New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. We're really excited to have you here with us. A quick note. This is a free service that we provide that connects your business with our extensive international Kiwi community. No matter where you want to export, your industry or your size, we're ready to connect you to experts who are ready to provide connection, mentorship, and also market intelligence. And this market intelligence is what's really crucial, especially for New Zealand, as we have an important relationship with the UK based on our shared history, strong people-to-people links, common values and interests. Unsurprisingly, together we enjoy a close and extensive trade, investment and commercial ties. The UK remains the significant export destination for New Zealand businesses, which leads us on to today. I'm so thrilled to be able to be joined tonight by Lord Gavin Barwell, former Chief of Staff for Theresa May, Paul Hardy, the UK Head of Government Relations for DLA Piper, and Nick Swallow, the Trade Commissioner for New Zealand Trade Enterprise, looking after the UK and Ireland. Here tonight, we're going to look at the current landscape, ahead to the FTA and their updates, and some changes that are still yet to come into effect. A few housekeeping points for tonight. It is being recorded, and we will be looking to share this on the KEA website post the webinar. There will be time for a short Q&A after everyone has spoken. If you do have any questions you'd like to pose to the panelists, please feel free to put them into the chat function. And if we don't get to your questions tonight, we will look to try and answer these offline. And if you would like to connect with any of the other businesses that are attending here tonight, we have about 37 individual businesses that are on the call tonight. We can certainly help with this as well, so please let us know and we can facilitate this after the webinar. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Paul Hardy. Welcome, Paul.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Hello all, very good to be here and very good to be part of this webinar tonight. My name's Paul Hardy. I am the Head of Government Affairs for DLA Piper in the UK. I'm also the Brexit Director, concentrating very much on Brexit work and trade-related work, as it's now become for clients. And I've been at DLA for 4 years. Before that, I was the EU legal advisor to the House of Commons and the House of Lords for 8 years. So Brexit kind of rather changed the trajectory of my career. And I spent 4 years helping companies to kind of prepare for and deal with Brexit, and now helping companies to deal with the trade and cooperation agreement and the consequences of Brexit. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Lord Gavin Barwell. So Gavin works as a senior political consultant for DLA Piper. So he works very closely with the UK Government Affairs team. Gavin was Theresa May's Chief of Staff from 2017 to 2019, as Sarah said, during, I think, the most tumultuous time in UK politics that anyone can remember. In other words, in living memory, with a Prime Minister trying to conduct Brexit negotiations without a sufficient majority in the UK Parliament, made life very, very difficult. in terms of politics, and Gavin was at the heart of that. So we're very, very proud to call him one of our own political consultants. He will talk to you about Brexit, about the politics of Brexit, about what he sees happening in general trade relations, and I will then follow with some more kind of detailed look at some of the supply chain issues businesses in New Zealand might be finding if they're using the UK as a stepping stone to distribution in the EU. So over to you, Gavin. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I guess good morning for many of you. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes, and I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the deal that has been done and what it means for businesses in the UK trading into the EU, but also for businesses in New Zealand and the trading relationship between New Zealand and the UK. And then probably half the time, Paul, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think that agreement might evolve going forward from where we are today. I think the starting point when looking at the deal is to ask yourself the question, who won in the negotiations? Who got most of what they wanted? And my answer to that, which is one you won't read too much in the UK media, is really that both sides won because they wanted pretty similar things. So as Paul was saying, I spent 2 years of my life working for Theresa May, who was trying to land a sort of compromise on Brexit. Her view was that the result was clear, but it was close. It wasn't a vote for a distant relationship. And she also felt very passionately about our United Kingdom and keeping that together. And obviously 2 nations of the UK had voted to remain and 2 had voted to leave. So she was trying to secure a compromise. And the EU basically offered us a pretty simple choice. You can either stay very close and stay in the single market and the customs union, or you can have a more distant relationship, a sort of standard free trade agreement. But if you do that, we'll need some special arrangements for Northern Ireland to make sure that we don't end up having a customs and regulatory border between Northern Ireland and Ireland and undoing the Good Friday Agreement and the progress that was made there. And Theresa didn't want either of those options. Staying in the single market and the customs union didn't feel like it was reflecting the way people had voted in the Brexit referendum, and having a standard free trade agreement for Great Britain, but a separate arrangement for Northern Ireland would mean a border within the United Kingdom, essentially, when goods move from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. She wasn't keen on that either. So she was trying to create some kind of compromise. The Johnson government, when Boris Johnson took over as Prime Minister, actually wanted something pretty similar to what the EU was offering. It didn't want to keep a close relationship with the EU. It wanted a fairly distant relationship, and it wanted to prioritize sovereignty, which in its eyes meant complete regulatory autonomy, not staying aligned with any, or committing to staying aligned anyway, with any of the EU's rules in relation to manufactured goods or agri-food products. And so really the only point of contention, Paul, in the negotiations, I think were on 2 matters. One, about what you do about Northern Ireland, where essentially the Johnson government gave in to what the EU was looking for. And we can see the consequences of that right now. And secondly, about so-called level playing field commitments. How much was the UK prepared to commit in terms of making sure that neither side had an unfair competitive advantage? And there, I would say, a sort of compromise was done. What I think is less well observed and goes to the heart of where we are now is that it wasn't just the British government that was prioritizing a political objective over what was best for its economy. The EU, I think, also did the same thing. It used to use this phrase, protecting the integrity of the single market, which was Brussels speak for don't give the Brits such a good deal that other people might be tempted to leave afterwards. And so it too didn't want to keep too close a relationship unless the UK was going to stay all the way in the single market and the customs union. And so, you know, the 2 sides, I think, essentially were after pretty similar things. And I think then looking forward, Paul, what does that mean now for businesses that are in the UK trying to trade into Europe? It means there's a lot more friction in the trading relationship. Now, we've signed a free trade agreement, but it's actually one that provides less free trade. It means that if you're trying to move goods from the UK to the EU, there are going to be customs checks and regulatory checks. It means if you're a service provider, you don't have all the rights of access that you used to have to the European market. If you're a financial services firm, you don't have passporting rights, for example. And if you're trying to move people between the UK and the EU, then with a few limited exceptions, you don't have free movement anymore, and you've got to engage with national immigration systems. If you're a business in New Zealand and potentially trading with the UK, I think because the UK now has both control of its own tariffs and regulatory autonomy, the prospects for a trade deal between the UK and New Zealand are very good and improving access there. So there are pros and cons to where we've ended up, but that is the current situation. In my final 2 or 3 minutes, I just want to reflect on what might happen next. And there's really 2 things that I want to say to people. The first is, do not believe the politicians when they tell you Brexit is done. Well, you said Brexit had sort of changed your career path over the last 4 or 5 years. I think it's going to keep you busy for the next 4 or 5. If you look at this deal, there are all sorts of specialized committees that are set up to look at how aspects of it could be improved. There are review clauses. There are bits of the trading relationship that weren't even covered in the TCA. So we have basically turned ourselves into Switzerland. We are going to be in almost permanent negotiation at a technical level with the EU going forward. And that leads me on to my last and my most important point, which is that I think that this deal is an unstable equilibrium. The UK has balanced itself on the top of a hill, and we're going to roll down one side or the other. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you're an optimist, you could take the view that these specialized committees that have been set up could over time chip away at some of the frictions that have been introduced into the UK-EU trading relationship and make things easier. We're not going to go back to rejoining the EU or rejoining the single market, but it would certainly be possible to improve on this deal and make the trading relationship UK to EU and indeed within the UK, GB to Northern Ireland, smoother and easier for business than it is at the moment. If you're a pessimist, and I'm afraid at least short to medium term, I am a pessimist, then you could take the view that one or both of the following 2 things are going to happen. First of all, that the Northern Ireland Protocol, the detailed arrangements for special arrangements for Northern Ireland that were in the original withdrawal agreement, are not going to prove politically sustainable. And there is a real danger that they could lead to a breakdown in the UK-EU relationship. But secondly, what the TCA basically says, if we simplify it down, is that the UK is free now to diverge in its regulatory standards as it sees fit. But if it does that, and that gives it some kind of competitive advantage, then the EU is free to respond by introducing barriers to trade under what's called the rebalancing mechanism to prevent its businesses being at an unfair advantage. And I suppose, Paul, the question that I would pose to people on the call tonight is, it would be a very odd thing if the UK had put itself through all of the pain and dislocation of Brexit and then didn't use the freedom to diverge at all. So it seems to me likely the UK is going to want to do that, and that is then going to have consequences for the UK-EU relationship. The sun is finally shining today here in the UK. We've had a pretty wet, miserable day, so I'm going to end on an optimistic note, Sarah, which is, if I'm pessimistic short to medium term about how this relationship is going to evolve, I'm a bit more optimistic long term. And the reason for that is I think that the fundamental driving force of the trading relationship between any 2 countries is the overall political relationship. And I think if you look at Russia or China or Iran or Myanmar or climate change, if you look at any of the big foreign policy challenges that the UK and the EU face, the threats are identical. And actually, Brexit has not led to any divergence in the UK approach to those issues. So long term, I think the fact that the UK and the EU face the same threats and have similar views of the world and how they should respond to those threats is likely to be a stabilizing force in the relationship. But my prediction would be for turbulence for the short to medium term, and it'll take a while before that shared geopolitical interest kicks in and hopefully improves things. I hope that's a useful summary, and I'll hand back to you, Paul.
Great. Thank you very much, Gavin. That was very useful and very insightful, as ever. And I suspect will prompt a number of questions, which we'll have time for at the end. I'm now going to lead on from that to talk about what kind of businesses are doing that we see firsthand, and how the trade and cooperation agreement has impacted daily life for many of our clients. I will agree with Gavin on many of the things that you've said. I also think that the trade and cooperation agreement was designed as a kind of platform rather than a ceiling. And I think that with sufficient goodwill, there is the basis kind of sewn into the agreement to develop it, and to develop closer ties, and to speed up a lot of the mutual recognition procedures, particularly customs and in certain goods sectors, that isn't there at the moment. But it requires political will. And I guess I am surprised, as a seasoned kind of EU UK watcher, I'm surprised by how quickly the good news of the deal dissipated into quite a rancorous discussions about Northern Ireland Protocol, about the diplomatic privileges of the European Commission's delegation in London, and typical kind of diplomatic spats that would indicate that all is not well in terms of that political relationship. But let's look at what clients are doing. It's really interesting. As a kind of Brexit advisor, the work that I've been doing has kind of naturally morphed into trade work and advising on trade agreements, and particularly the trade and cooperation agreement. 80% of our advice is for manufacturers or distributors of goods, 20% for service providers. And that's kind of a nice inverse, isn't it, to the UK's economic output, which is principally where we're services exporters. I think we're the largest services exporter in the world, pro rata. And yet actually the impact of Brexit on the services sector, particularly the services sector not regulated by the EU, has been quite muted. And that's actually because the rules are rather harder to discern. You have to look into very detailed annexes to see what kind of services access a UK service provider can get in the EU. And I suspect what's happening is that a lot of businesses are purely kind of unaware that there may be any new restrictions, and there'll be a growing realization over the months and year to come that actually some services which you could provide on the basis of membership of the EU will no longer be able to be provided, and you'll have to rely on national approvals in the state in which you sell a service to get that approval. So that's about 20% of what we've done, and it's, I think, the first time we as a firm in the UK have been advising on market access under services in trade deals, simply because being part of the single market in goods and services meant that it wasn't a topic that ever kind of came across a general counsel's desk or really a supply chain director's desk. In terms of goods, it's totally different. The change from EU membership to the trade and cooperation agreement has been really marked in the manufacturing and distribution sector. And that's because you've had black and white regulatory changes that have affected supply chains. Many businesses have been preparing for that over the last 2 to 3 years, but like all major events, you can prepare and prepare, and it's without doubt the best course of action to do so. There's always going to be an element of surprise in any regulatory change. There's always going to be an element of policy misstep, policy oversight, views taken by different customs authorities, and therefore the chances of chaos with a change of as big as this were huge, and for a time it was chaotic. The regular I think the most important pieces of advice we give at the moment is all about origin of goods, because under a trade agreement between the UK and the EU, it's great that it's a tariff-free agreement. What a lot of businesses didn't pick up, with good justification, because the rules of origin weren't published until the 24th of December, and the agreement came into force on the 31st of December, was whether a good that was, let's say, imported from New Zealand, processed in the UK, and then exported to the EU would be a UK origin good and a New Zealand origin good. What were the rules of origin that applied to it? And I think that's been the most important area of work, and that is advising on how to maintain preferential tariff access for goods entering the EU from the UK and vice versa. The second area that's been problematic is rules about importation for customs purposes, and a lot of businesses finding out that if they want to be an importer of record, which is an import declarant on an import declaration, they need to have an established entity in the UK or in the EU, and in the absence of that, they need to use a customs agent to act as that importer of record. Again, that's a problem that has settled a bit, but in the first 2 months was a major issue, as a lot of customs agencies were questioning in what capacity they were acting for importers and exporters. And together with that is product regulation rules, the fact that if you export a product into the EU from the UK, in terms of guaranteeing the traceability of that product and guaranteeing that product, or certifying that product applies with EU single market goods rules, you actually need an importer to be established in the EU to do that. And you can imagine there are hundreds of thousands of UK exporters who hadn't realized that they needed to have an EU entity to vouchsafe for the quality of the standards of the import. And that again has been a huge and frenetic area of work for us. I see, and you may disagree with this from your own experiences, and it'd be good to talk about this afterwards, but I see the changes to the UK and EU border as teething changes. That's not to underestimate how significant they can be, but I do think that within the next 6 to 9 months, those teething changes will, for the most part, die down. Where I see problems being more endemic are in the Northern Ireland Protocol, and what was once an internal movement within the United Kingdom's customs union of goods from GB to Northern Ireland as a consequence of as a consequence actually of the withdrawal agreement. We now have a trade border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and I would say that moving goods, particularly food and other heavily regulated sort of phyto and phytosanitary products, or sort of sanitary and phytosanitary products, is so heavily regulated and complicated, and also mired in political disagreement, that movements of goods from GB to Northern Ireland are really complicated, and the difference between that and what existed before Brexit is stark indeed. And there, I don't see many signs of improvement in the relations between the UK and the EU on this. The EU would like the UK to adopt EU sanitary and phytosanitary measures. The UK wants a dynamic relationship where we can apply EU measures but adapt them. So I think the Northern Ireland Protocol, like Gavin, I think is a real flaw in the agreement, and an area where bitter politics could actually destabilize a really important long-term trading relationship. one really interesting issue to be aware of is that something that the UK didn't get in the negotiations is it didn't get diagonal accumulation from the EU. It got bilateral accumulation, and I have seen the impact of not being able to achieve agreement on what's called diagonal accumulation in the trade and cooperation agreement writ large in the work we're doing for clients. So under a bilateral agreement, you may well know a bilateral accumulation agreement, products from the UK that are then moved to the EU are a part of a processing in the EU, and then are moved back to the UK, and further UK products are added. And everyone thinks of the aerospace or the automotive supply chain sector as being a perfect example of where goods are crossing a trade border all the time. Bilateral full accumulation means that those goods can still obtain tariff-free access when the final good is moved from the UK to the EU, because the EU parts are considered to be UK parts and vice versa. Diagonal accumulation, it really is a kind of a Shangri-La for many states, because that means that you're asking the EU to say, not only do we recognize goods made in the EU and the UK, but we also recognize goods made in Canada, which has an EU agreement, and the UK has an agreement with Canada as well. So you're looking at saying where both the UK and the EU have free trade agreements with that third country, let's just agree that the rules of origin apply to all three countries. And for many businesses with supply chains that are using the EU as a base in which to export to the UK or vice versa, not having diagonal accumulation means that there is generally a risk of a double tariff hit. So I'm a New Zealand company, I export to the UK, I then hold my goods in the UK, I don't process them, I keep them in a warehouse. Unless I keep them in a customs warehouse, in customs suspension, if they actually enter for free circulation in the UK, and I've had to pay a tariff on the import into the UK, when exactly those same goods move to the EU, there's another tariff hit. And that means the whole question of the UK as a kind of, as a manufacturing distribution hub for the EU is in question. And I see businesses thinking about the rationality of exporting directly into the EU and cutting the UK out of the supply chain for that very reason. If you've got the same thing with Canada, again, you may have a Canadian widget is imported into the UK. It's tariff-free under the UK-Canada Free Trade Agreement. That doesn't mean it's tariff-free under the UK-EU tariff agreement. That actually probably means there is a tariff. If you had diagonal accumulation, you would avoid the tariff there. So there's a whole question about global Britain, is what role the UK plays as a distribution hub for the EU. I'm going to take off a few other issues, which I think will be kind of upmost in a lot of people's minds. I think there will be a data protection agreement. I think the European Parliament has sort of swallowed its pride and its principles and is willing now to give its support for the Commission draft decision to recognise the UK as adequate, which will be good news indeed. In fact, if the EU weren't to recognise the UK as adequate, then the movement of personal data from the EU to the UK would be subject to expensive mitigation measures that some of you may know about. I think that the big question for a lot of us is divergence and convergence. To what extent will the UK diverge from EU standards? And there I agree with Gavin. I think the politics of this means that if you can sell divergence as a dividend of Brexit, kind of why not do it? And I see that happening all the time in post-Brexit policy. So you have kind of regulatory unit set up in the cabinet to review regulation with a view to changing from EU standards. I think, to put it really simply, where our international trade obligations, existing trade obligations, and our international trade objectives require us to comply with certain international standards, I suspect we will comply with those standards, because we'll be cutting off our nose to spite our face if we didn't. In other words, you know, you can't simply apply unilateral standards in an area which then gets regulated as part of a trade agreement, because you're not going to get the trade agreement as a result. Where there are areas of policy where the UK can act unilaterally with little cross-border consequences, then the scope for deregulation is much higher. That said, I think that the UK will push the envelope in areas, particularly in services, and in financial services being one of them, in professional services and recognition of qualifications. I think the UK will push the envelope further to be different from the EU in areas of service regulation, which it calculates is in the long-term economic interest of the UK. And interestingly, this new bill on recognition of the status of professional service providers is a really interesting example of an enticing policy that's designed to persuade third countries to think the UK is changing its approach, and changing its approach from the EU approach. So I can't think that something like goods and a lot of goods regulation, although we will have a separate regime, which will quite often mean dual regulatory approvals in the UK and the EU, but in terms of standards, you'll be disincentivizing a lot of people, a lot of businesses investing in the UK, if you ask them to make products to a standard that's different to the standard that's applied in the EU when they are selling a lot of their products to the EU. Last point on free ports, I think this is illustrative of what's going on. I personally think that there is a lot to be very excited about in terms of post-Brexit Britain, only because there is this blank canvas, and I'm afraid to say I think it's still quite blank, but there's no doubt that there is this scope now to define a new Britain. All we have at the moment is well, and that's not true. We have Build Back Better. We have this Queen's speech with 28 or 29 new pieces of legislation for the next Parliament. Some of those are critically important. But we have this kind of canvas, and it's up to us, or it's up to the government, to paint it in the way that it will. I think you will see serious opportunities, serious efforts to change the emphasis of the UK economy, to minimise the north-south divide, to build on R&D, and to encourage FDI. So I think there are a lot of things out there. There's a lot of policies up for play. Free ports is a really interesting one, because there you've got a bit of sell that this is what we can do now that we're outside the EU. But if you look at free ports, they don't often, or they don't always promise what they deliver. Free ports tend to really benefit those economies that have high tariffs on imports of intermediary goods, because you can then use those intermediary goods which are imported tariff-free to make products which are then less expensive to import to the UK. But actually the UK has a fairly low intermediary product tariff rate under the global tariff. I think there's a lot of devil in the detail to see the extent to which free ports are going to change the way the UK customs system works, and also the way it'll regenerate areas of the UK. So I think, like everything, that whether a free port works or not is deeply complex. It's absolutely right that we look at it very closely, and this government will look at it. I think the obvious gains are actually not that obvious to get, and require really clever political thinking and policy to get there. I've gone on a bit longer than expected, so than you expected. So my apologies, and I'll stop there.
No, not at all, Paul. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. There was a lot for us to take in, and just, yeah, so thankful for the insights you've shared with us. And I guess now on to Nick.
Yeah, kia ora tātou, and good evening for those in the UK, and good morning for those in New Zealand. And thank you, Sarah, for the opportunity to speak on this panel. So I've spent 3 years in the UK in the role as Trade Commissioner. And prior to that, I was New Zealand Trade and Enterprise Regional Director in Latin America and New Zealand's Consul General in Brazil. And in shades of history repeating, I lived through a pandemic. I don't know if you remember Zika. And at some very tumultuous political times with the president being ousted at that time through impeachment. So some might say that, you know, it was good training for this role, but and look, it's just fascinating to get this insider's look at the state of Brexit from Gavin and Paul. So thank you very much for this. This evening, I'll be covering the UK-NZ trading relationship. I'll look at the current state of play with UK economy, discuss the impacts of Brexit on New Zealand companies, and highlight some of the changes to come, and finish on outlining the progress of the free trade agreement negotiations between the UK and New Zealand. So the UK is the 6th largest trading partner for New Zealand, and there are deep ties between our people. We clearly have common values and interests, a shared history, and much commonality in our institutions. And for that reason, the UK has been and continues to be an attractive and significant market for New Zealand goods, and particularly for high value products and smart services. The UK is a sophisticated market for New Zealand, and there is a lot of good opportunities. And two-way trade between the UK and New Zealand sits at around 6 billion New Zealand dollars or 3 billion pounds. So the breadth of goods and services New Zealand is exporting to the UK is surprising. You know, there's the high profile exports of lamb, apples and wine, but trade has significantly developed in other areas such as fashion, fintech, particularly off the back of Xero, the cloud-based accounting software, which has built an entire ecosystem in New Zealand that's extended around the world of fintech companies out of New Zealand. Agri-tech has been a significant contributor here. Skincare, healthcare technologies, logistics, security, and the list goes on. And there are iconic New Zealand companies such as Gallagher Security and Mainfreight that are currently making significant investments in the future of the UK in this market, and also working in with their European markets. Despite what has been a challenging year with COVID and Brexit, I think there's cause for optimism. According to the Bank of England, the UK economy is expected to grow by 7.5% in 2021, which would be a significant bounce back from the 9.9% contraction in 2020. And unemployment is set to be lower than expected. And much of this optimism that's around at the moment can be attributed to the success of the vaccination program in the UK. For those not familiar, we're up to, I think, about sort of 60% of people having their first dose. But there's some caution that comes with this optimism, as some highly transmissible variants of the virus are recently identified as possible threats to future easing of restrictions. And throughout the pandemic, NZTE has been tracking consumer sentiment support around New Zealand businesses as well, to support New Zealand businesses making informed decisions about how best to respond to the challenges faced. And after 14 months of an altered life, the feeling amongst consumers at the moment is a bit more subdued. For the most part, things are opening up, and many are opting for a wait and see approach, and people are feeling cautious, and many feel drained by the ordeal at the moment. But the exception, the ray of light in that, is that the under 35 age group, which is actively socialising and spending, the caution there is that that's the group that's only just really reaching the vaccination stage. So much of the recovery I spoke about earlier is reliant on this group opening up, as 50% of the respondents to the survey that we've been tracking have said that they've saved more than £100 per month, which mirrors the Bank of England's findings in terms of household savings. And there's a strong reserve of consumer demand to spend over summer. Most notably, though, the purchasing habits have made seismic shifts in a short space of time. According to a PwC report that was recently released, more than 17,500 chain store outlets have disappeared from the UK high street in the first year of the pandemic. And that stark figure is matched by the striking figures of those purchasing online. In the UK, sales rose by 36.6% in 2020. with online sales now making more than a third of total retail sales. And and a credit to New Zealand companies who are very quick to adapt to the shift. We work with a lot to move into the digital and social media channels to promote and sell their products and adapting their message to the UK market. And this consumer trend is definitely set to continue, with a third of the respondents to our survey stating that their new online shopping habits are firmly embedded. And the shift in behaviour doesn't end with the how people are purchasing, but also is extending to what they are purchasing. For example, there's been a noticeable increase in New Zealand wine sales in the UK throughout the pandemic, and it's clear that in a time of crisis, the Brits have fine taste. So the UK is the largest export market for New Zealand wine. And in January this year, it was reported that New Zealand wine exports to the UK grew by 7% in volume throughout the previous year, as well as capturing more value per bottle as well. And the Kiwi producers did extremely well to capture more of the market too, with Sauvignon Blanc sales and off-trade, so in groceries and supermarket stores, in total grew by £180 million in the year to April 2021, and New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc made £116 million of that additional market share. And so as the pandemic continues to shape behaviours, we'll see further changes in consumer trends that will provide opportunities to New Zealand companies. So that's been one headline for Kiwi companies, but the other to contend with, and still is Brexit. And following the transition period on the 1st of January this year, the UK left EU's customs union single market, as we heard earlier, and goods that were moving across the previously frictionless UK-EU border became imports and exports. And as many on this webinar will be aware, this resulted in the introduction of custom formalities such as declarations, documentation and checks that were not previously required. And there's also been changes in some of the labelling certification requirements and exports to the EU from the UK and more regulated sectors. And so that's been heavily affected at the end of the transition period. New Zealand companies looking to Europe traditionally have used the UK as a hub to import their products into the UK and then send them on to the EU. However, with the new UK-EU trading relationship, as we heard Paul talk about, this means that fulfilling EU customer orders from the UK has become less straightforward. And some New Zealand companies have needed to review and adapt their supply chain response. And while the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement allows for tariff-free trade between the UK and the EU manufactured goods between the two markets, it doesn't apply to goods in New Zealand, as we heard about from Gavin and Paul, or markets where there is no trade agreement with. So New Zealand made goods that were previously exported to the UK, then sent to the EU before January 2021, now have the possibility of facing that second tariff where they did not previously. And it's not only the trade in goods that's been affected by these changes, there are various implications for companies that trade in services, tech companies, including the impact of leaving the EU's data regime, which I think we'll might hear a little bit more about. Paul touched upon changes to short-term business travel and visa restrictions, although business travel hasn't been as prolific as previous with the pandemic. VAT implications and digital services and the loss of passporting rights for financial services firms. So further, the full implications of Brexit are not yet fully felt and understood. There still are a number of changes to come through. And most notably, I'll just touch on a couple. On the 1st of January 2021, there was easements for goods that were moving from the EU into the UK. And there's a 175-day rolling deadline for the submissions of and declarations with customs. And that 175-day deadline comes up in just 1 month on the 25th of June. So companies will need to be declaring those goods. And the same in terms of from the 1st of October, a requirement for pre-notification for products of animal origin and high-risk foods and animal byproducts will be required. So things like export health certificates and the introduction of a new system for tracking those things. And then the 1st of December 2021, there is the end of the easement period that I talked about with the 175-day rolling deadline for the submissions. And actually there's further restrictions that we placed on through until at this stage, April 2021. But I think, as Gavin and Paul alluded to earlier, it's an ongoing and evolving agreement, and we expect to see further changes, particularly in areas like regulation. The potential of how the UK could diverge from the EU is not yet known, although we've had a bit of an insight from our panelists this evening, and could increase further over coming years. They will require exporters to potentially comply with two sets of standards. And there are many areas in which the UK and the EU can diverge, such as financial services and highly regulated sectors and food and beverage requirements. And you know, the sort of the light on the hill, the thing that we're looking towards is New Zealand is currently negotiating a free trade agreement with the UK. And this is the most significant change in the trading relationship between the two countries since the UK joined the European Economic Community's common market in 1973. And New Zealand's objectives for this free trade agreement is to swiftly secure a high quality, comprehensive and inclusive trade agreement with the UK that builds on our already strong relationship and a lot of commonality, as I mentioned earlier. And an agreement that reflects our shared interests in being at the forefront of the global trade agenda as our economies recover after the pandemic. And we heard a bit from Gavin there about the types of shared interests. An FTA will bring New Zealand and UK businesses, workers and consumers even closer together by providing a platform to grow trade investment, greater UK-New Zealand cooperation on sustainable development and inclusive trade issues. There is a lot we can do together to advance these objectives, including by promoting engagement and trade for Māori export businesses, small to medium enterprises and women-led businesses. And in terms of where this is up to, there's been 4 rounds of negotiations have been completed to date, with a 5th round scheduled for very soon in early June. And steady progress has been made on the texts of the first 3 chapters, which have been substantially concluded. And they're looking at small and medium enterprises, competition policy, and trade remedies. And so New Zealand and the UK recently agreed to accelerate free trade talks with a view to reaching agreement in the coming months. And as part of this commitment, Minister O'Connor, New Zealand's Minister for Trade and Export Growth, has announced he'll be travelling to Europe to meet with the UK and European trade counterparts to push this negotiation together with the EU-NZ free trade agreement and pushing those towards both towards conclusion. That said, Minister O'Connor continues to state that there is a significant amount of work to do to ensure the market access outcomes, particularly for agriculture, reflect the ambition jointly set for the FTA. Our #1 priority remains a high quality, comprehensive, inclusive FTA, and we won't compromise the quality of agreement just for the sake of speed. So between Brexit, the pandemic, and now FTA negotiations has never been a dull moment in the NZ-UK trading relationship. And what we see at New Zealand Trade and Enterprise has been an increase in interest from New Zealand and the UK, and that interest turning into activity, and particularly in the first half of this year. And so we're optimistic about the future and welcome supporting more Kiwi businesses to grow over here. So thank you very much, Sarah, and I'll finish up there.
Amazing, thank you, Nick. That was insightful and great to hear. Obviously, for our wineries that are on the call tonight, the success that New Zealand wine is having over here at the moment. So I'm going to bring everybody back. We do have some questions that have come through, and we'll look to get on to answering these. Okay. Sorry. So for the first question that we have for Gavin, I think this one is for you. What is your take on the UK economy in the coming years? The UK has borrowed heavily with COVID, and there have been some initial negative impacts from Brexit, but where do you see this in the future?
I think Nick covered some of this very well in what he said. Look, the UK economy had a really tough time last year. It was one of the worst affected in the global economy. But all of the projections are for a very strong bounce back over the next 2 years. The recent IMF forecast had the UK economy over those 2 years growing faster than both the US and the EU. So I think that the prospects are very good. It could be a slightly strange recovery because I think it's possible that you could both have some strong growth, but also some distress when the government emergency help during the pandemic gets wound down during the autumn. I think in terms of the sort of politics, the government in the UK has published is a rare thing, a very helpful government document that gives a very good précis of what their economic strategy is, which is called the Plan for Growth. If people want to look it up, it was published at the time of the March budget. And I think given that we're tight on time, just three quick things I would say about it. The first is that the Prime Minister holds up the development of the vaccines as a model for economic recovery. In other words, what he wants to see is a very dynamic private sector coupled with a strong and active government. So, you know, this government is not Thatcherite. It's more sort of Michael Heseltine. It's a sort of active industrial policy engaging with the private sector. And I think his two key political priorities as we recover will be levelling up, which for those not familiar with UK politics is a term that's used to describe the government's aspiration to get geographic equality across the UK, to try and ensure that our economy is not so dominated by London and the southeast. And the government has a strong political incentive to do that, given that the seats that it won at the last election were predominantly in the Midlands and the North. And secondly, the sort of green industrial revolution, the focus on net zero and climate change and the decarbonisation of our economy. I think they will be the two big political priorities. Finally, on the sort of pessimistic front, what are the worries, I think, at the moment? One would be, are we going to see an inflation spike? You know, obviously the Biden administration in the US has made a huge fiscal injection into their economy, and that's having consequences across the world economy. So we'll have to see how that plays out. And I think there's also a little bit of concern about sort of zombification, where government help has basically kept some companies alive, but they're in such a difficult position in terms of debt that they haven't got money to invest and innovate and develop over time. So I think the overall outlook, very positive, as I said, levelling up, green industrial revolution, the sort of key policy priorities, concerns about inflation and about zombification.
Amazing, thank you, Gavin. And then I think also for Gavin and Nick, a bit of a topical one from tonight, the FTA. Does the FTA with the UK mean we'll be able to export goods from the UK from New Zealand to the UK and then into the EU without paying tariffs all the way along? Do you think there will be any further changes on this?
So I think Paul actually went into this in quite a lot of detail around diagonal accumulation. So as Paul mentioned, exporting between the UK and the EU based on the current rules of origin that are put out in the TCA is quite clear that what needs to be done with goods to meet that tariff-free amount or to meet that rule of origin to remove the tariff. The issue we have is that New Zealand could end up in a situation that Paul mentioned, I think, surrounding Canada, where we have a free trade agreement with the EU and a free trade agreement with the UK. However, we're not in a position to take advantage of free trade between the UK and the EU because of those rules of origin. Now, unless something changes with diagonal accumulation and the TCA, my understanding is we're stuck in that position, but I would have no view on whether that is likely to change in the future or not. Perhaps Gavin or Paul, you might have a view on that.
So I think it is a possible change if the UK-EU relationship moves in a more benign direction, but I don't see I don't think it's likely in the immediate term, given all the difficulties that Paul and I were both rehearsing. And I completely share your judgment. At the moment, as things stand, then the lack of diagonal accumulation would stop what the questioner was asking, was aspiring towards.
I agree, and I would just add that, so what the kind of things that businesses are thinking about is, can you import from New Zealand into the UK? When you import into the UK, you use a customs procedure so that the import doesn't enter into free circulation, and therefore there is no legal import and no tariff to be paid. And a customs warehouse, and this is the basis of the free port idea, So you import into a customs warehouse, and you're then able to export from or move the goods from the UK, from the customs warehouse, directly to the EU, and that would be the only tariff payment that you make. Now, using that is depend on rules like direct transport rules in trade agreements, but a lot of businesses are looking at what they can do within customs warehouses to avoid that first tariff.
Yeah, and actually the UK has been very generous in reducing the requirements around becoming a customs warehouse to support or facilitate some of that as well. So there is the opportunity, and I'm not sure the exact dates, but to be able to deem premises customs warehouse without things like bonds and stuff like that at the moment. But yeah, there are special customs procedures to get around those two things, but it's not always straightforward.
Unfortunately not. We have one more question that's actually coming from the floor this evening. The EU is introducing new rules to which forbid the labelling of certain products as milk, etc., when they don't come from a cow's udder. Will the UK adopt EU laws such as this going forward?
Is that question on? I haven't seen that. Here we go. Well, the answer is, I mean, the kind of high level answer is that the UK will not necessarily do that. So that's not an answer, is it? That's a politician's answer. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that the UK is not obliged to do that. Whether the UK would do that will, I think, depend on the politics and the science behind doing that in the UK. And also, if it didn't do that, whether it would affect trade between the UK and the EU. So I think with all these questions about whether the UK will converge or diverge, you have to look at what the consequences of not converging, for example, on this piece of milk regulation, would be on UK exports of milk to the EU. I would think that if the consequences were limited, then the UK will feel that it has free discretion to not to follow this rule. On the substance, I'm afraid I don't know the details about UK policy on that.
I just add to what Paul said. He's exactly right. The UK is under no obligation to do so. I think the even more important point is it doesn't necessarily get any benefit from doing so. Because goods are undergoing regulatory checks at the border anyway. So further divergence in those areas, unless it was being held to give some competitive advantage to the UK not to follow, in which case the EU could use the rebalancing mechanism, there isn't actually an incentive to stay aligned anymore. Whereas if you'd gone for the kind of deal Theresa was following, where at least the UK was getting friction-free trade with the EU in return for staying aligned, there would be a strong incentive to stay aligned. I think the other thing to bear in mind, and I don't know, I'm afraid, the detail of that particular regulation, is whether it's covered by the protocol. Because if GB didn't follow those regulations that are covered by the protocol, it would add greater friction within the UK, and that would be there'd be a strong incentive to avoid making that any worse.
Actually, it's a very good question for outlining really the whole point around Brexit from the UK perspective, and that it really is now, it doesn't matter if it's the bend that a banana needs to have or the maximum suction power of a vacuum cleaner. It's up to the UK to decide, rather than before when these rules were a part of the EU.
Yeah, it's a really good exam question, isn't it? It just teases out all the issues that Brexit brings.
Certainly does. Well, I think we are just about out of time, and I'm conscious that it is a very late night for those of us in London and in Europe, but also New Zealand has got to kick on with their day. So a massive thank you to Paul, Gavin and Nick for your time this evening, and also to your team's time in terms of helping with the preparation for tonight. I know some valuable insights that our Kiwi businesses will be taking away from our call tonight. I really do appreciate it. If there's anything further that you'd like to to reach out to us. We've shared the contact details on LinkedIn for myself and Nick, and then also George, who's happy to field any queries on behalf of DLA Piper. So please do feel free to reach out, and thank you all again for joining us, and enjoy your evening and your day in New Zealand. Haere rā from London. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.